The wagon hit a rock and Ilara's teeth cracked together so hard she tasted blood. Nobody in the cart looked at her. Nobody had looked at her since they crossed the old stone bridge and the pine trees turned black against a sky the color of a bruise. She counted the trees instead. She counted anything. Counting kept her hands from shaking. The soldier across from her had a scar that ran from his ear to his collarbone, and every time the wagon jolted, his hand went to the hilt of his sword out of habit, not fear. He was not afraid of anything in these woods. That was the part that frightened Ilara most. A man who has stopped being afraid of the dark has usually made peace with what lives in it. Her village had given her up in 4 days. 4 days from the council meeting to the wagon leaving. Nobody had voted against it. Her own aunt had packed her a bag of dried apples and would not meet her eyes while she did it. That was the last kindness anyone showed her before the border. A bag of fruit that would go soft before she ever ate it. Because grief closes the throat faster than hunger. The gates of Black Pine Castle did not creak. They were too well kept for that. Black iron swung open by men who did not speak to her, who did not speak at all, who moved like the cold did not touch them. Ilara stepped down from the wagon into snow that came past her ankles, and felt, for the first time in her life, entirely erased. Not frightened, erased. As if the person she had been in her village, the girl who laughed too loud at her brother's jokes and burned the bread twice a week, had been left behind at that stone bridge, and only a shape of her had continued on into the castle. They did not let her rest. A woman with iron-gray hair and no warmth in her face pulled her through corridors that smelled of tallow and old stone, into a chapel with frost on the inside of the windows, and told her to stand there and be quiet. Ilara stood. She was good at being quiet. Her whole life had trained her for exactly this, standing still, while decisions were made above her head, in rooms she wasn't allowed into, by people who never once considered that she might have a preference. The king came in without ceremony. That was the first surprise. She had expected trumpets, banners, some show of power to match the stories that traveled south about him, the ones the old women told to frighten children into obedience. Instead, a door opened at the side of the chapel, and a man walked through it the way a person walks into a room they own and are tired of owning. He was tall in a way that made the ceiling seem lower. His hair was black and cut close, and his eyes, when they finally landed on her, were the pale gray of a sky right before snow. He did not smile. He did not scowl either. He looked at her the way a man looks at a ledger, checking that the numbers matched what he'd been told. Varan Ashwood, king of the Black Pine Wolves, said exactly 9 words to her before the priest began. "You will not embarrass this house." Understood. It was not a question. Ilara had already learned enough, in 4 days of travel and a lifetime before it, to know that men like this one did not ask questions they expected answers to. She said yes, because the alternative was worse, and the ceremony went on around her like weather, something that happened to the world rather than something the world chose. The wedding took 11 minutes. She knew because she counted the chimes of the chapel bell, the only clock she had. 11 minutes to bind her name to his, to make her a queen in title and a stranger in every way that mattered. And when the priest finished speaking, Varan did not kiss her. He nodded to her, the same nod he might have given a soldier who had completed an acceptable task, and walked back out through the side door without another word. The woman with iron-gray hair, whose name Ilara would later learn was Governess Mabel, though nobody in that castle used first names easily, led her to a room on the 3rd floor with a fire already burning, and furs already laid out, and told her that dinner would be brought to her, that she was not required at the evening meal, that she should rest. Ilara understood the shape of the sentence even though the woman never said the true words inside it. You are not wanted at his table. You are wanted in his bloodline. Those are different things, and you had better learn the difference quickly if you want to survive this house. That first night Ilara did not cry. She had expected to. She had cried on the wagon, twice, quietly, into the collar of her coat where the soldier with the scar could pretend not to notice. But in the room with the fire and the furs, something in her went still instead. A kind of cold clarity settling over the grief like ice over a pond, and she lay awake listening to sounds she did not recognize. A howl, once, far off, that did not sound like any animal from her home valley. Footsteps in the hall that paused outside her door, and then moved on. The castle breathing around her, old and enormous, and utterly indifferent to whether she lived or died inside it. She thought about her brother. She thought about the bread she used to burn. She thought about the fact that somewhere below her, in a hall she had not seen, a man who was now legally her husband, was almost certainly not thinking about her at all. In the morning, a servant girl no older than 15 brought her water for washing, and would not look at her directly either, though this girl at least seemed nervous rather than cold. glancing at Alara sideways like she was trying to memorize her face for a story she'd tell later. Her name was Tilly. She was the first person in that castle to say more than 4 words to Alara, and what she said, whispered while pouring water into the basin, was this: "Nobody's lasted long here, my lady. The last one before you left in a box." Alara did not ask what kind of box, and Tilly did not offer to explain, and the silence between them said everything that needed saying. Alara spent the first week learning the castle by learning which doors did not open for her. The library, locked. The East Tower, locked. The war room, obviously locked, guarded by 2 men who did not blink when she walked past. She was allowed the gardens, frozen and empty. She was allowed the chapel, where she went sometimes just to sit somewhere that felt like it belonged to no one in particular. She was allowed her room, her fire, her furs, and the increasingly heavy silence of a marriage that existed on paper and nowhere else. She saw Varen twice in that first week, both times from a distance, both times in passing. Once in the courtyard, where he stood surrounded by men in armor, giving orders in a voice that carried without him raising it, a voice built for command the way some voices are built for singing. Once in the corridor outside the great hall, where he walked past her so quickly she barely had time to step aside, his eyes flicking to her for half a second, registering her presence the way a man registers a piece of furniture that has been moved slightly out of place. It was on the 9th night that they collided, and neither of them had planned it. The castle at night was a maze of unlit corridors, and Alara had gone looking for water after the fire in her room burned low and made her too warm to sleep, and somewhere between her chamber and the kitchens, she took a wrong turn in the dark and put her hand out to steady herself against what she believed was a wall. It was warm. Her first thought, absurd and immediate, was that the castle stone had somehow retained heat from some hidden furnace behind it, and she pressed her palm flatter against it, curious despite the late hour and the cold in her feet, and the wall made a sound low in its chest that was unmistakably a growl. She did not scream. She would think about that later, why she hadn't screamed, when screaming would have been the reasonable thing to do. Instead she froze, hand still pressed to warm flesh that was absolutely not stone, and a voice above her, rough with something that might have been sleep, or might have been restraint, said one word: "Move." She moved. She stepped back so fast she nearly fell, and a hand caught her elbow before she hit the floor, a hand far too large and far too warm to belong to any ordinary man, and in the thin moonlight bleeding through a high window, she saw him properly for the first time since the chapel. Varen, without his crown, without his cord around him, in a plain shirt that did nothing to hide the size of him, his eyes catching the moonlight in a way human eyes did not, a faint gleam like a cat's in torchlight. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Ilara's heart was going so hard she could feel it in her ears, and she told herself it was fear, only fear, nothing else, though some small dishonest part of her noted that fear did not usually make the skin at her wrist, where his fingers still rested, feel quite so warm. "I was looking for water," she said, because the silence had gone on long enough that someone needed to break it, and apparently it was going to be her. "The kitchens are the other direction," he said. His voice was quieter than it had been in the courtyard, not gentle, just quieter. He let go of her elbow. She felt the absence of his hand more than she wanted to admit. "You should not walk these halls at night," he said, and turned to go, and that should have been the end of it. A small, strange moment folded away and forgotten, except he stopped after 2 steps and, without turning back around, said something else. "The wolves that guard the outer wall do not know your scent yet. Until they do, stay in your room after dark." It was not kindness. She told herself that very firmly as she watched his back disappear down the corridor. It was practicality. A king protecting property, nothing more. The same as he might warn a servant away from a loose stone on the stairs. But she lay awake a long time that night turning the words over. "Stay in your room after dark." And she noticed, with something between irritation and confusion, that they had not sounded like an order. They had sounded, just barely, like he did not want anything to happen to her. The days after that were not different in any way Alara could have described to another person, and yet they were different. Varen still did not sit with her at meals. He still walked past her in corridors with barely a glance, but small things began to happen that she could not trace to any single cause. Firewood appeared outside her door before dawn, more than the servants usually brought, stacked with a neatness that suggested it had not been left by a servant at all. A coat appeared in her wardrobe one morning, heavier and better made than anything she had brought from her village, and when she asked Tilly about it, the girl's eyes went wide, and she said only that it certainly had not come from the household stores, that someone must have ordered it specially, and then she would not say another word on the subject, no matter how Alara pressed. Alara began, against every instinct that told her not to, watching for him, not seeking him out, just watching, the way a person watches weather, trying to learn its patterns. She noticed that he ate alone at the head of the long table most nights, that the seat beside him, her seat, sat empty, because he had never once invited her to fill it, though the servants set a place there anyway, every single night, as if in quiet protest of a decision none of them had the standing to challenge aloud. She noticed that the other members of his court, the men and women who had grown up in this castle and knew its politics the way Alara knew the taste of her aunt's bread, treated her with a careful distance that was not quite cruelty and not quite kindness. They were waiting, she realized, waiting to see if she would matter, if she would last, if she was worth the risk of being kind to before the king himself had decided what she was for. What she was for. The phrase sat in her chest like a stone she'd swallowed. She knew, of course, everyone knew. A human Omega traded to a Lycan king existed for exactly one purpose, and the whole castle moved around that single fact like a wheel around its axle. She was not a wife. She was a vessel for something the kingdom needed and had not yet received, and every kindness shown to her, the firewood, the coat, the careful gray eyes that flicked to her and away again in the corridor, existed in the shadow of that single unspoken expectation. It should have made her hate him. She tried some nights to work up a proper hatred, lying in her furs and cataloging every reason she had for it. He had not chosen her as a person. He had not asked her name before the wedding, only confirmed it, the way a man confirms a shipment has arrived undamaged. He had left her alone in a castle full of strangers with nothing but a warning about wolves and a coat she hadn't asked for. But hatred, she found, was harder to hold on to than she expected, because underneath all of it sat a smaller, quieter observation that refused to leave her alone. He had not touched her, not once, not in any way she had been warned to expect, not in any way the frightened whispers of her village had prepared her for. Whatever Varan Ashwood was, whatever violence lived in the stories told about the Blackpine wolves, he had not shown her a single moment of it directed at her own skin. That did not make him safe, she reminded herself of that daily. A wolf who has not yet bitten you has simply not yet decided to. But it made him strange in a way she had not been prepared for. A king who demanded an heir and yet seemed, in every private moment, to be avoiding the very woman meant to provide one. 3 weeks into her marriage, Alara stood at her window, on a night when snow fell so thick, the courtyard below disappeared entirely into white, and she watched a shape cross that courtyard alone, tall and unmistakable even through the snow, moving toward the outer wall where the sentries stood at their posts. She watched him stop and speak with one of the guards, watched the guard's posture change from alert to something almost relaxed, the particular ease of a man who trusts his commander completely. She watched Varan put a hand briefly on the guard's shoulder before moving on, a gesture so small and so human that it did not match anything she had expected from a king the world called a monster. She did not understand him. She would tell herself, again and again in the weeks that followed, that understanding him was not her job, that her job began and ended with the single purpose she had been brought here to serve. But standing at that window, watching snow swallow a man who moved through his own kingdom like he was constantly bracing for something he refused to name, Alara felt the first crack in the wall she had built around her own heart, on the day the wagon crossed the stone bridge. It was such a small crack, she barely noticed it happening. But cracks, once they begin, do not close on their own, and neither of them, not the king pacing his frozen courtyard nor the human girl watching him from a high window, understood yet what was about to grow through it. The full moon came on a night Alara had not been warned about, which she would later understand was itself a kind of mercy, because if she had known what was coming, she might have spent the whole day in dread instead of the ordinary business of learning where the castle kept its linen stores. She noticed the change before she understood what caused it. The servants moved faster than usual, tighter around the shoulders, and Tilly, bringing the evening water, would not meet her eyes at all that night, not even sideways. "Is something wrong?" Alara asked, and Tilly's hands shook slightly around the basin. "The moon is full tonight, my lady. Best you stay in your room, all the way through till morning. Don't open your window even to look." Alara had heard the stories, of course, the ones told in her village by firelight to frighten children, wolves that grew larger and lost their minds along with their shapes, men who became something with no memory of the person they'd been by morning. She had assumed, the way a person assumes things they have never tested, that such stories were exaggeration built on fear of what people did not understand. She did not stay in her room. It was not defiance, not exactly. It was that same restless watching that had taken hold of her these past weeks, the need to see rather than be told, and so when the castle fell into a hush so complete it felt like held breath, Elara wrapped herself in the coat that had appeared in her wardrobe and went, quietly, to the window that looked over the courtyard where she had once watched Varan cross the snow. What she saw did not match the fireside stories at all. He came out into the courtyard alone, the same as any other night, but there was a tension in his shoulders that had not been there before, a stiffness, like a man walking toward pain he has agreed to endure, because the alternative is worse. The guards who usually stood at their posts had withdrawn to the far wall, giving him the center of the yard entirely, and Elara understood, watching them keep their distance with the particular respect of men who have seen this many times before, that whatever was about to happen was not something anyone here found frightening in the way she'd expected. It was something they found sacred. The change did not happen the way the stories described it. There was no sudden burst, no violence of transformation played for horror. Instead, Elara watched Varan go still, utterly still, his head dropping forward, and a shudder passed through him that seemed to come from somewhere far beneath his skin, an ache visible even from 3 floors up. He made a sound then, low and pained, not quite human and not yet anything else, and his body began to change in ways that Alara's mind struggled to hold steady, bones shifting under skin, his shape lengthening and dropping toward the ground, dark fur replacing the plain shirt that fell in tatters around him. She should have looked away. Every instinct told her to look away, and yet she found she could not, because underneath the awe of watching something so far outside anything her human life had prepared her for, she saw something else entirely. She saw pain. She saw a man enduring something enormous and lonely, alone in a snow-covered yard while his own guards kept a respectful distance. And when the change finished and a wolf larger than any animal she had ever imagined stood where her husband had been, its head lifted and its pale eyes, the same pale gray she had seen across a chapel on her wedding day, found her window immediately, as if he had known she was there the whole time. Neither of them moved for a long moment. The wolf did not growl at her. It did not look away either. It simply held her gaze across the falling snow with an expression she could not name in an animal's face, and yet understood perfectly anyway. Something between warning and something far gentler than warning, and then it turned and loped toward the tree line beyond the outer wall and vanished into the dark. Elara stayed at that window until the sky began to gray with dawn. She told herself she stayed out of curiosity, the need to see him return, to understand the shape of this thing she had married into. But some part of her, the part she was still learning to be honest with, knew she stayed because she did not want him to be alone out there if he did not have to be, even if he never knew she'd kept that vigil. Even if it changed nothing at all. He returned as the first gray light touched the snow, human again, wrapped in a blanket one of the guards handed him without a word, moving like a man who had run miles and fought something and won, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He did not look up at her window that time. She did not know if that meant he had forgotten she'd been watching or if he simply could not bear to be seen so spent. She never told anyone what she had witnessed. Not Tilly, not the governess, certainly not Varan himself. It became the first secret she kept in that castle that was entirely her own, a private knowledge folded away next to her heart, and in the days that followed she found herself watching him differently, not with less caution, but with a kind of recognition that had not existed before, an understanding that the crown he wore, and the power that made grown soldiers give him space in a snowy yard cost him something enormous every month, something he carried alone because no one in his own household seemed to think he deserved anything else. 3 days after the full moon, she was in the covered walk between the kitchens and the great hall, when Varan came around the corner too quickly and nearly walked into her. He caught her before she stumbled, the same as their first collision weeks before, his hand steady at her waist, and for a moment neither of them moved. "You watched," he said. It was not a question. Alara's first instinct was to deny it. Her second instinct, stronger, was that lying to this man would cost her more than honesty would. "I did," she said. "I'm sorry if I wasn't meant to." He studied her for a long moment, his pale eyes moving over her face like he was trying to read something written too small to see easily. She expected anger. She had prepared herself for it walking these halls every day since. The possibility that he would consider her presence at that window a trespass she could not undo. Instead, he said, quietly, "Most people who see it can't look at me the same afterward." "And how do I look at you?" she asked, because the question had come out before she'd decided to ask it. He did not answer right away. His hand was still at her waist, warm even through the fabric of her dress, and something in his expression shifted, some wall lowering by an inch that she had not seen move before. "The same," he said finally. "You look at me the same." He let go of her then and stepped back, and whatever moment had opened between them closed again just as quickly. But Alara carried those 4 words with her for days afterward, turning them over the way she'd once turned over "stay in your room after dark," trying to understand a man who gave so little of himself away and yet, in these small, unguarded seconds, gave her more than she suspected he gave anyone else in his kingdom. It was around this time that Governess Mabel began to soften toward her, in small ways that Alara almost missed entirely. An extra blanket delivered without being asked. A comment, offered almost against the woman's will, that the king had not smiled properly in years before Alara's arrival, though she would not elaborate further and changed the subject the moment Alara tried to ask. The court itself remained wary. Alara understood why. She was still an outsider, still human in a castle of wolves, still bound to a purpose that had not yet been fulfilled and that everyone around her measured her worth against, whether they said so aloud or not. But something had begun to shift in the quiet corners of the castle, in the firewood and the coat and the 4 honest words in a covered walkway, and Alara found herself, against every warning she had given her own heart, beginning to hope for something she did not yet have language for. She did not know, standing in that walkway with the memory of his hand still warm at her waist, that hope in that castle was a far more dangerous thing to carry than fear had ever been. Fear, at least, she knew how to survive. Hope would cost her in ways she could not yet imagine, and the price would come due long before she was ready to pay it. Lady Miriam arrived at Blackpine Castle on a morning so cold the fountains in the courtyard had frozen solid, and Alara knew before anyone introduced them that this woman was going to be trouble, because the whole castle changed its rhythm the moment her carriage passed through the gate. She was Varan's mother, though nobody used that word around her, always Lady Miriam, always with a small bow, as if the title alone were not enough to hold the weight of what she represented in that house. She was smaller than Alara expected, delicate in the way that made people underestimate her right up until she spoke, and when she finally did speak to Alara directly, 3 days after her arrival, in the corridor outside the library that Alara was still not permitted to enter, her voice carried the particular chill of someone who had already decided everything worth deciding. "You are the human," Lady Miriam said, not a question. "I'm Alara," she answered, because she had learned by now that giving her name back was the only small rebellion available to her in moments like this. Lady Miriam's eyes moved over her the way a merchant examines livestock, assessing, cataloging, already moving past the assessment toward whatever conclusion she'd arrived at before she ever left her own estate. "You understand why you're here." "I understand what I was told," Alara said carefully. "Then understand this as well." Lady Miriam stepped closer, close enough that Alara could smell her perfume, something sharp and floral that did not suit the cold stone around them. "My son needs an heir before the Winter Council meets again, or the northern houses will use his empty cradle as an excuse to challenge everything his father built. You are not a wife in any sense that matters to this family. You are a solution to a problem, and the sooner you accept that, the easier your time here will be." Alara did not answer right away. She had spent her whole life being told what she was for, by her village, by her aunt who packed dried apples instead of meeting her eyes, by the king himself in 9 words spoken before a wedding that lasted 11 minutes. She had thought, by now, that she was used to hearing it. She discovered, standing in that cold corridor, that being used to a thing and being unbothered by it were not the same experience at all. "I understand my responsibilities," she said finally, because it was the only sentence she could produce that did not shake. "Good," said Lady Miriam, and swept past her without another word, leaving behind only the sharp scent of her perfume, and a silence that pressed against Alara's chest like a stone. She did not tell Varan about the conversation. She told herself this was because it did not matter, because Lady Miriam had said nothing that the whole castle did not already believe quietly among themselves. But the truth, closer to her heart than she wanted to admit, was that she did not want to see whether Varan would defend her, or simply agree with his mother's assessment of her purpose. Some fears are worse to confirm than to simply carry, unanswered, in the dark of your own mind. Instead, in the weeks that followed, she watched him more carefully than ever, cataloging every small gesture as evidence for a case she had not yet let herself name. He began seeking her out, not often, not obviously, but enough that she noticed the pattern: a walk in the frozen garden that turned out not to be accidental, a book left outside her door, one of the few from the locked library, with a note in handwriting she did not recognize saying only that he thought she might enjoy it. Dinner, once, just once, where he sat beside her at the long table and asked her, in front of the whole assembled court, what her village had been like, and listened to her answer as if it mattered. Word of it reached Lady Miriam quickly. Everything in that castle reached Lady Miriam quickly. She cornered Alara again a week later, This time in the small chapel where Alara had taken to sitting in the quiet hours before the household woke. "You are making him soft," Lady Miriam said, without preamble, without any greeting at all. "I am not making him anything," Alara answered. "I am simply here. Simply here is exactly the problem. A king who grows attached to the vessel carrying his heir is a king who makes decisions with his heart instead of his crown. My son cannot afford softness. The northern houses smell weakness the way wolves smell blood, and if they believe for one moment that he has grown sentimental over a human girl, they will use it against everything his father bled to build." Alara felt something rise in her chest that surprised her with its heat, something closer to anger than she had allowed herself to feel in this castle since the day the wagon crossed the stone bridge. "Then perhaps," she said, before she could stop herself, "your son should be trusted to know his own mind, rather than have it managed by everyone around him as though he were a child." Lady Miriam's face did not change, but something in her eyes went sharp and cold, in a way that told Alara she had made an enemy far more dangerous than she had realized. Someone who would not forget those words, who would file them away and wait for the right moment to make Alara regret them. That moment came sooner than Alara expected, though not in the way she anticipated. It was the physician who told her first. An old man with kind eyes and hands that shook slightly with age, called to examine her after weeks of illness in the mornings that she had blamed, wrongly, on the unfamiliar cold of the northern winter. He confirmed what her own body had already begun to suspect and delivered the news with the careful gentleness of a man who understood better than most in that castle what such news would cost her. "You are with child, my lady," he said. "Early yet, but certain." Alara sat very still after he left, alone in her room, one hand pressed flat against her stomach, and waited to feel something she could name. She had expected joy, perhaps, or at least the satisfaction of a duty fulfilled. What she felt instead was something far more complicated. A fear that had nothing to do with the physical realities of childbirth, and everything to do with the realization that had been building in her for weeks now, quietly, beneath every small kindness Varan had shown her. She had, without ever intending to, without ever giving herself permission, begun to fall for a man who had married her only to solve a problem, and now that problem was solved, and she did not know, lying alone in that cold room with her hands still pressed to her stomach, whether the solving of it would bring her closer to him, or take from her the only reason he had ever had cause to look at her twice. The court's reaction, when the news broke 2 days later, confirmed her worst fear before she had even finished shaping it into words. The relief that swept through Blackpine Castle was enormous, visible in every face she passed, servants smiling at her properly for the first time, guards nodding to her with something like respect, Lady Miriam herself sweeping into her chambers with an expression of triumph so complete it made Alara's stomach turn. "At last," Lady Miriam said, "at last this house has what it needs." Varan's reaction, when he finally sought her out that evening, was the one Alara had been bracing for without knowing it, and it confirmed everything she had feared far more precisely than his mother's triumph ever could. He came to her room after dark, something he had never done before, and stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking, his face unreadable in the firelight. "The physician tells me it's confirmed," he said. "It is," Alara answered. She waited for him to cross the room. She waited for some gesture, some word, anything that would tell her this news meant something to him beyond the political relief written so plainly on every other face in that castle. Instead he nodded once, the same nod he had given her at their wedding, the nod of a man confirming a shipment had arrived undamaged, and something in Alara's chest cracked cleanly in two. "Thank you," he said, formally, distantly, and turned to leave, and it was only as he reached the door that something in his composure seemed to falter, his hand tightening on the frame, his shoulders going rigid in a way that did not match the calm words he had just spoken. He left before she could ask him what was wrong. She lay awake long after, turning the moment over, and could not decide which was worse, that he had shown her nothing at all, or that in the one unguarded second before he vanished into the corridor, she had seen something that looked less like joy and far more like panic, buried so quickly under duty that she almost convinced herself she had imagined it. She had not imagined it. She would understand that much more clearly in the weeks to come, though understanding it would not make the path ahead of her any easier to walk. The months that followed her news moved differently than the ones before it, faster in some ways, slower in others, the way time always seems to bend around a body carrying something it has not yet learned to hold steady. Alara's mornings grew harder before they grew easier. The physician, whose name she learned was Aldrich, visited her often enough that she came to look forward to his careful hands and quieter kindness, a small pocket of gentleness in a castle that measured her worth now almost entirely by the shape of her stomach. He never once spoke to her the way the rest of the household did, never reduced her to the vessel Lady Miriam so plainly considered her. He asked after her sleep, her appetite, whether she felt well, and seemed to actually wait for her answers. "You've done this before," she said to him once, during one such visit, watching him check her pulse with the same patient thoroughness he brought to everything. "Many times, my lady," he answered, "though never for one quite like you." She did not ask what he meant by that. She was learning, in this castle, that some comments were better left unexamined, their meanings allowed to sit unspoken rather than dragged into daylight where they might cost someone something. Varan's behavior in those months confused her more than anything else in that confusing house. He did not withdraw from her entirely, the way she had half expected after that strange guarded moment in her doorway, but neither did he draw closer in any way that matched the growing size of the child between them. He asked after her health with the same formal concern he might show a valued advisor recovering from illness. He arranged for better food to be brought to her table, softer bedding, a physician on constant call. He never once touched her stomach, never once asked to, never once spoke of the child as though it were a person rather than a milestone the kingdom needed reached. She caught him once, late at night, standing outside her door in the corridor, simply standing there, not knocking, not entering, just present in the dark for long enough that she heard his breathing through the wood, before he finally moved away. She never told him she'd heard him. She never asked him why he'd come. Some questions, she was learning, cost more to ask than to simply carry unanswered. It was Tilly, in the end, who gave her the first real piece of the puzzle, offered hesitantly one evening while braiding Alara's hair by the fire. Her voice dropped low even though no one else was in the room. "The last Omega who came to this castle, before you, my lady. Do you know why they say she left in a box?" Elara went very still. She had heard the phrase before, in her very first days here, and had never worked up the courage to ask further. "She was carrying," Tilly said, "same as you are now, and something went wrong in the birthing, the way it sometimes does, and the king was near out of his mind with grief, they say, though he'd never shown a lick of feeling for her before that. Screamed the walls down, the old staff say. Screamed like the wolf inside him had come out without the moon calling it. Some say that's why he keeps himself so shuttered now. Some say he decided right then never to let himself care for another one of you, in case the same thing happened twice." Elara sat with that information long after Tilly had gone, turning it over like a stone worn smooth by handling. It did not excuse the distance. It did not undo the ache of watching him nod formally at news that should have brought a husband to his knees with joy. But it reframed something she had not let herself examine closely enough. The possibility that his coldness was not indifference at all, but a wall built brick by careful brick against a grief he had already survived once, and did not believe he could survive twice. She began, without deciding to, watching him with something closer to compassion than resentment, and that shift in her own heart frightened her more than any cruelty from Lady Miriam ever had, because compassion, she was learning, made a person vulnerable in ways that resentment never could. The Dowager Queen's campaign against her, meanwhile, had not slowed simply because Elara now carried the heir everyone claimed to want so badly. If anything, Lady Miriam grew bolder, certain now that Alara's usefulness had been secured, and her feelings therefore no longer mattered to anyone's calculations. She began appearing at Alara's meals uninvited, correcting her posture, her manner of speech, the way she held her hands folded in her lap, small humiliations delivered with a smile so that anyone watching would see only a mother-in-law offering gentle guidance, rather than the systematic dismantling of a young woman's confidence that it actually was. "The child is Black Pine's," Lady Miriam told her once, quite plainly, over a dinner where Varan was absent on some border matter. "Whatever affection has grown between you and my son changes nothing about that fact. When the child is born, its education, its safety, its future, all of it belongs to this house, to this family, to the traditions my husband and his father before him built with their own blood. You would do well to remember that your role ends the moment the cradle is filled." Elara set down her fork very carefully, because her hands had begun to shake and she refused to let this woman see it. "And what role do you imagine I'll accept, once that cradle is filled?" she asked. "Whatever role this house permits you," Lady Miriam answered, and there was no cruelty in her voice at all, which somehow made the words land harder than if she had shouted them. "That is how it has always worked here. That is how it will continue to work, long after both of us are gone from this table." Elara did not repeat this conversation to Varan either. She was beginning to understand, with a clarity that frightened her, that every conversation she chose not to repeat to him was a small brick added to a wall of her own, a wall built not against him exactly, but against the possibility of hoping for a rescue that might never come. If she told him what his mother said and he did nothing, the hope she still carried, however carefully guarded, would die completely. She was not yet ready to let it die. Not yet. It was Governess Mabel, of all people, who finally gave her the piece of information that would change everything that followed. The woman found her alone in the garden one gray afternoon, sat beside her on the frozen bench without asking permission, and spoke without any of her usual chill. "You should know, my lady, that Lady Miriam has already begun arranging a wet nurse and a household separate from yours for when the child comes. Rooms on the far side of the castle, staffed entirely with people loyal to her, not to you. She means to raise that child herself, in all the ways that matter, and leave you visiting hours the way a guest visits a house that is not her own." Alara felt the cold of the bench seep through her coat and settle somewhere deeper than her bones. "Does the king know this?" she asked. "I do not know what the king knows," Mabel said, and her voice, for the first time since Alara had arrived in this castle, carried something that sounded almost like sorrow. "I know only that this house has swallowed better women than you before this, my lady, and spat out very little of what made them themselves. If you mean to keep any piece of that child as truly your own, you will need to decide, and decide soon, what you are willing to do about it." Alara sat in that frozen garden long after the governess had gone, watching her own breath fog in the cold air, and felt something settle in her chest that had not been there before, quiet and heavy and entirely her own to carry. It was not yet a plan, but it was the seed of one, and in the weeks that followed, as her body grew heavier with the child that the whole castle had already claimed for itself, that seed began, slowly and carefully, to take root. The confrontation Alara had been dreading arrived on an evening she had not prepared for, in front of an audience she had not chosen, and it settled the question she had been avoiding for weeks with a finality that left no room left for doubt. It began small, the way most disasters in that castle seemed to. A visiting delegation from one of the northern houses had come to pay respects and confirm, with their own eyes, that the rumors of an heir on the way were true. Lady Miriam had insisted on a formal dinner. The whole court assembled, Alara seated at Varan's side for the first time in a public setting large enough to matter, her condition by then impossible to hide beneath even the most carefully chosen gown. The northern lord, a heavy man with a beard the color of iron, spent most of the meal addressing Varan directly, as if Alara were a piece of the furniture arranged tastefully beside him rather than the woman carrying the very air this whole gathering had been called to confirm. She bore it quietly, the way she had learned to bear most things in this house, until Lady Miriam, emboldened by wine and the northern lord's evident approval, turned the conversation in a direction Alara had not anticipated. "Of course," Lady Miriam said, smiling in a way that did not reach her eyes. "Once the child is born, proper arrangements will be made for its care. We would not dream of leaving something so precious in the hands of someone so unfamiliar with the responsibilities of our house." The northern lord laughed, a booming sound that filled the hall, and made some comment about human blood needing careful management before it could be trusted near a throne, and the whole table laughed with him, easily, comfortably, as though Alara were not sitting 3 feet away listening to her own child discussed like livestock whose breeding required oversight. She looked at Varan. She had told herself she would not look at him, that she would bear this the way she bore everything else, silently, without giving anyone the satisfaction of her reaction. But some part of her, the part that still carried a seed of hope she had not yet managed to kill, needed to see whether he would say something, anything, to close the distance between the woman he had married and the mother of his child. He did not. He sat with his jaw tight, his hands still on the table, and said nothing at all, and the silence stretched long enough that the northern lord took it for agreement, moved the conversation on to matters of border patrols and spring planting, and the moment passed as though it had never happened. Alara excused herself before the meal ended, claiming exhaustion, which was not entirely a lie, and walked back to her room through corridors that felt colder than they had in months, and it was there, alone, that the last careful brick in the wall around her heart finally settled into place. Varan found her an hour later. She heard him before she saw him, his footsteps heavier than usual, and when he entered without knocking, something he had never once done, she saw in his face an expression she had not seen there before. Something raw and uncertain, that did not match the composed king she had grown used to. "I should have said something," he said, without preamble. "At the table." "You should have," Alara agreed. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I did not know what to say that would not make it worse for you tomorrow. My mother has allies among the northern houses that I cannot afford to lose right now. If I had contradicted her in front of that delegation, she would have found a way to make you pay for it after they left, in ways I could not have stopped." So instead I paid for it in front of everyone, Alara said, and something in her voice must have carried more than she intended, because Varan flinched, actually flinched, the way she had never once seen him do in all the months she had known him. That is not what I meant, he said. It is what happened, she answered. He was quiet for a long time after that, standing in the doorway the way he so often did, close enough to enter and yet never quite entering, and Alara watched him search for words that did not come easily to a man who had spent his whole life learning to say as little as possible. I do not know how to do this, he said finally, and the admission seemed to cost him something enormous. I have spent years building walls around every soft part of myself because the last time I let someone in, I lost her, and I lost the child with her, and I do not know how to want something again, without also expecting to lose it. Alara felt her own resolve waver, hearing that, felt the old ache of compassion rise up to compete with the anger she had earned so carefully that evening. But compassion, she reminded herself, had not once, in all these months, translated into a single moment where he had chosen her over his mother's politics, over his own fear, over the careful distance he maintained even now, standing in her doorway and still not crossing the threshold. Then perhaps, she said quietly, you should decide, before this child is born, whether you are capable of wanting something enough to fight for it, because I do not think I can spend the rest of my life standing beside a man who explains his silence to me in private and never once breaks it in public. He did not answer that. He stood in the doorway a moment longer, and then he left, and Alara lay awake that whole night with one hand pressed against the child moving inside her, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after months of confusion, that she had just asked him a question he was not yet able to answer, and that she could not build the rest of her life waiting for an answer that might never come. The weeks that followed carried a strange, careful quiet. Varan did not withdraw from her entirely, but neither did he offer the fight she had asked for. He grew gentler in small private moments, sat with her sometimes in the evenings without speaking much, brought his own hand once, hesitantly, to rest against her stomach when the child kicked hard enough to make her gasp, and something in his face when he felt that movement for the first time was so unguarded, so entirely without armor, that Alara nearly forgave him everything in that single instant. But the public silence continued. Lady Miriam's campaign continued with it, unchecked, growing bolder as the birth drew nearer. Arrangements for a separate nursery moving forward with a momentum that Alara could feel even without being told directly. Servants she did not recognize appearing in wings of the castle she had never been permitted to visit. Whispers that stopped the moment she entered a room. She understood, by the time the snow began falling in earnest that winter, that she had a choice to make, and that no one in that castle, not Varan, not his mother, not the physician who had grown so gently fond of her, was going to make it for her. The guard's name was Callum, and he had been assigned to walk the corridor outside Alara's room since her second month of carrying. A quiet young man from a border village not so different from the one she had left behind, and in the long stretches of afternoon when the castle seemed to forget she existed at all, he had become, without either of them quite deciding it, the closest thing to a friend she had in that entire fortress. He was not a wolf by birth, she learned, but a human who had earned his place in the King's Guard through years of loyal service, one of a small number of humans trusted enough to carry a blade inside Blackpine's walls, and perhaps it was that shared strangeness, both of them human in a house built for something else entirely, that made him easier to talk to than anyone born within these stone walls. You look tired today, my lady, he said one afternoon, as she sat in the covered walk watching snow gather on the far wall. I am always tired now, she answered, which was true, though it was not the tiredness of her body that weighed on her most. He did not press her further that day, but over the following weeks, in small, careful pieces, she began telling him things she had not told anyone else in that castle, not the arrangements Lady Miriam was making, not the silence at the northern delegation's table, not the strange, gentle moment when Varen's hand had rested against her stomach and felt, for one unguarded second, like something real. Callum listened without judgment, the way a person listens who has learned the value of simply being present, and it was to him, finally, on a gray afternoon 3 weeks before her expected time, that Alara admitted the thought she had been circling for months, without daring to name it aloud. I do not think I can leave this child in that woman's hands, she said. Whatever happens between me and the king, I do not think I can watch my daughter raised by people whose only interest in her is what she represents for their politics. Callum was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was careful, measured, the voice of a man choosing each word with the weight it deserved. There is a village 3 days south of the border, he said, my own mother's village, before she married north. A midwife there, a woman named Nora, delivered half the children in that valley, including myself. She owes my family a debt older than either of us, the kind of debt that gets honored without questions asked. If a person needed somewhere quiet to have a child, away from castle eyes, that would be as safe a place as any I know. Alara felt her heart go very still, hearing that. The seed that had been growing quietly in her chest for weeks suddenly finding, for the first time, a shape it could actually take. "Why would you help me with this?" she asked. "You serve the king. This would be a betrayal of your post, perhaps worse." Callum looked at her for a long moment, and something in his plain, honest face carried more conviction than any speech could have. "I have watched this castle chew through good people since I was young enough to first hold a blade," he said. "I do not know what is between you and the king, and it is not my place to say. But I know what it looks like when a child is being planned for before it is even born, weighed and measured for what use it can be to people who have never once asked what might be good for the child itself. I would rather betray a post than watch that happen to a baby who has done nothing to deserve it." They did not speak of it again for several days, but the plan, once spoken aloud, took on its own quiet momentum. Callum arranged, through channels Alara did not fully understand, and did not ask him to explain, a message sent ahead to the midwife Nora, confirming that a woman might arrive before winter's end, needing quiet help and no questions. He mapped, in his mind rather than on any paper that might be found, a route south that avoided the main roads, using gatehouses and old paths that a border-raised guard would know, and a castle-raised soldier would not think to watch. Alara, for her part, began preparing in the only ways available to her, without raising suspicion. She set aside small amounts of coin from what allowance she'd been given, hidden in the lining of the coat that had appeared in her wardrobe all those months ago, the first gift Varan had ever given her now serving a purpose he could never have imagined. She learned, through careful questions to Tilly that never quite revealed her true intent, which nights the outer gate guards changed shifts, which hours the castle slept most deeply. She told no one else, not Governess Mabel, whose sympathy she trusted but whose loyalty to the household she could not fully gauge. Not the physician Aldrich, though she suspected, in the gentle way he sometimes looked at her in those final weeks, that he saw more of her intentions than she ever spoke aloud. And not Varen. This was the decision that cost her the most, turning it over on countless sleepless nights in that final month, watching him from across rooms where he still would not close the distance she had asked him to close, still would not fight the mother whose politics mattered more, in every public moment, than the wife carrying his child. She told herself, again and again, that telling him would only force him into a choice he had already shown, over and over, that he was not ready to make, and that the kindest thing she could do, for both of them, was to make the choice herself, and let the consequences fall where they would. But some nights, lying awake with her hand on the movement of the child inside her, she allowed herself to imagine a different version of this story, one where Varan crossed the threshold of her doorway instead of stopping there, where he told his mother, plainly and without apology, that his wife and his child came before any northern alliance, where the wall he had built after losing the last woman he'd loved, finally came down, instead of simply cracking at the edges and holding steady anyway. She held on to that imagined version of him even as she packed the small bag she would carry south, folding it into the same private place in her heart, where she had once folded the memory of a wolf's pale eyes finding her window across a snow-covered courtyard, holding both truths at once, the man who had failed her and the man she still, despite everything, could not quite stop hoping he might become. 3 weeks before her time, on a night when the moon hung high and cold above Black Pine's black towers, Alara lay in her bed with the small bag hidden beneath her floorboards, and understood that the plan was as ready as it would ever be. All that remained was the waiting, and the waiting, she was learning, was often the hardest part of any decision a person ever had to make. The labor began 2 weeks earlier than the physician had predicted, on a night when a storm had rolled in off the mountains and buried the courtyard under snow so deep it swallowed the sound of the world entirely, and Alara understood, feeling the first deep pull low in her back, that whatever plan she and Callum had built now had to bend itself around a timeline neither of them had chosen. She sent word to him through Tilly, a single line scratched on a scrap of paper that said only the storm has come early, meaning something else entirely to anyone who did not already know the plan. And within the hour, Callum appeared at her door under the guise of a routine watch check, his face carefully neutral for the benefit of anyone passing in the corridor, though his eyes carried a tension that matched her own. "Can you walk?" he asked quietly, once the door was closed. "For now," she said. "Not forever. There is a gatehouse a mile past the eastern wall," he told her. Small, unused since autumn, meant for shepherds moving flocks in warmer months. I have already sent word ahead to Nora that the timeline has moved. If we go now, before the storm worsens, we can be there before anyone in this castle even notices you're gone. Alara looked around her room one last time. The fire she would not see burned down again. The wardrobe holding the coat she was already wearing. The window where she had once watched a wolf find her gaze across a courtyard full of snow, and felt something in her chest tighten with a grief she had not expected to feel for a place that had never once felt like home. She left a single letter on her pillow, folded and sealed, addressed to no one by name, because she could not decide, even in that final moment, whether it was meant for Varan or for herself. A record of everything she had never said aloud in that castle. And then she followed Callum out through a servant's passage that ran behind the kitchens, into a night so cold it stole the breath from her lungs before she had gone 20 steps. The walk to the gatehouse took longer than either of them had planned, slowed by the storm and by the pains that came now with increasing insistence, tightening low across her back and stomach in waves that made her stop and grip Callum's arm until they passed. He did not rush her. He did not panic, though she could see the worry in the set of his jaw every time she stopped, and he kept up a low, steady stream of talk as they walked, about his mother's village, about the shepherds who used this path in summer, about anything at all that might keep her mind from the growing certainty that this child was coming faster than any of their careful plans had accounted for. They reached the gatehouse as the storm peaked, and Callum built a fire in the small hearth with hands that shook slightly from cold and urgency both, and it was there, in a stone room meant for shepherds and their flocks, that Alara understood the plan to reach the midwife's village had already failed. There would be no 3 days south. There would be no quiet arrival at a stranger's door. There was only this room, this fire, and a labor that had decided, on its own terms, that it would not wait for anyone's convenience. "Callum," she said, between one wave of pain and the next, "you need to find someone, anyone. I cannot do this alone, and neither can you." He left her only once, sprinting back through the storm toward the outer wall to find the one person he trusted enough to bring into a secret this large, and he returned within the hour, with Governess Mabel wrapped in a cloak far too thin for the weather, her face pale with cold, and with the shock of what she had just been told. "You foolish brave girl," Mabel said, kneeling beside her without another word of judgment. And from that moment the older woman's hands took over with a competence that spoke of experience Alara had not known she possessed. Experience earned, Alara would learn much later, from years spent quietly assisting every difficult birth this remote household had ever weathered. The hours that followed blurred into pain and firelight, and Mabel's steady voice guiding her through each wave, Callum standing guard outside the gatehouse door with his sword drawn against a threat that never came, because no one in that storm-buried castle had yet noticed that their queen was missing from her bed. Ilara's daughter was born just before dawn, in a stone gatehouse meant for shepherds, delivered by a governess who had spent months treating Alara with careful distance and now held her hand like family. And in the first moment she held that small warm weight against her chest, Alara forgot, entirely and completely, every careful plan she had built to carry this child away from Blackpine forever. She was perfect. She had a full head of dark hair, the same black as her father's, and when her eyes opened briefly in the firelight, they carried the faintest hint of pale gray that made Ilara's breath catch in her throat. For 6 hours, Ilara held her daughter and let herself imagine every version of a future she had spent months refusing to hope for. She imagined raising this child in the midwife's southern village, teaching her to bake bread that never burned, telling her nothing of wolves or castles or crowns. She imagined, in her weakest and most honest moments, a different version entirely, one where she carried this child back through the storm to Blackpine's gates, and placed her in her father's arms, and watched, finally, the wall around his heart come down completely at the sight of his daughter's face. It was Mabel, watching her hold that child with an expression of such naked longing, who finally asked the question Ilara had been avoiding even in her own mind. "What will you do now, child?" she asked, and there was no judgment in the question at all, only a tiredness that came from having asked variations of that same question to other frightened women in other difficult hours, long before Ilara had ever arrived in this castle. Ilara looked down at her daughter's sleeping face, at the small, perfect weight of her, and understood, with a clarity that arrived like the first light of dawn breaking through the gatehouse's single narrow window, exactly what she was going to do, and exactly what it would cost her to do it. She had promised Blackpine an heir. That promise had been made before she ever knew the shape of her own heart, before she understood that a bargain struck between a frightened village and a demanding king could grow, against every reasonable expectation, into something that looked almost like love and yet never once received the protection love was supposed to guarantee. The child was owed to this house by every law and custom that governed it, and Alara understood, holding her daughter in that gatehouse as the storm outside finally began to break, that she could not take that promise from Blackpine entirely, not without dooming her daughter to a lifetime as a fugitive from a kingdom with wolves enough to find her wherever she ran. But she could decide, in this one final moment, exactly how that promise would be kept, and what it would cost the people who had never once fought hard enough to keep her. "Mabel," she said, her voice steadier than she expected it to be, "I need you to carry her back to the castle, to the chapel steps, where the stone cradle sits empty. Leave her there, wrapped warm, before the household wakes for morning prayers." Mabel's face went very still. "And you, child, what of you?" "I cannot go back into that house," Alara said. "Not to be managed by Lady Miriam, not to watch my daughter raised by servants loyal to a woman who called her a solution to a problem before she ever drew breath. But I will not steal her from her birthright either. Let her be found exactly where the bargain always said she belonged, in Blackpine's cradle, claimed by Blackpine's king. Let him decide, once and for all, whether he wants only the heir, or whether he was ever capable of wanting more than that." Callum, standing in the doorway with the storm's last winds tugging at his cloak, looked as though he wanted to argue, and did not. "And if he chooses only the heir," he said quietly, "then my daughter will still have been given to the house that owed her a place in it," Alara answered, "and I will have lost nothing I had not already lost the night he stayed silent at that northern lord's table." She held her daughter for one more hour before the sky grew too light to wait any longer, memorizing the weight of her, the small sounds she made, the faint gray already fading from her eyes into a deeper, more settled color that Alara would never see finish changing. She wrapped her in the coat that had been Varen's first and only real gift to her, the warmest thing she owned, and pressed one long kiss to her daughter's forehead before handing her, with hands that did not shake even though her whole chest felt as though it were tearing apart, into Governess Mabel's waiting arms. "Tell him nothing of where I've gone," she said. "Let him wonder, let him understand, finally, what it costs to lose something silently and be given no explanation at all." Mabel nodded once, her own eyes bright with tears she did not bother hiding, and turned to carry the child back through the thinning snow toward the castle's black towers, while Callum helped Alara to her feet and turned his face south, toward a village and a midwife who still, after everything, waited to receive a woman who no longer carried the child she had originally sought their help to protect, but who needed, now more than ever, somewhere safe to begin whatever came next. Alara did not look back at Blackpine Castle as they walked away from it. She told herself this was strength, the same careful discipline that had carried her through a wagon ride, and a wedding and 11 long months in a house that had never once made her feel entirely welcome. But some part of her, walking south through snow that had finally begun to soften under a pale winter sun, understood that she was not being strong at all. She was simply protecting the one part of herself that had not yet broken completely, the part that could not bear to watch those black towers disappear behind her, and know, with total certainty, whether her daughter would grow up loved or simply governed. She left an empty cradle behind her in every sense that mattered. The stone one at the chapel steps would not stay empty for long, she knew, filled within the hour by a governess carrying out one final act of quiet loyalty to a girl she had grown, despite every early coldness, to genuinely care for. But the cradle Alara had once imagined filling herself, in some version of this story where a king learned to love his wife as completely as he had learned to fear losing another child, that cradle she left behind in the snow completely and finally, and walked away from it without permitting herself a single backward glance. Dawn broke fully as she and Callum crested the last ridge before the border road, and somewhere behind them, in a castle just beginning to stir for morning prayers, a king was about to discover exactly what silence had cost him, though neither Alara nor Callum yet knew how deeply that discovery would shake the foundations of everything Blackpine had built its power upon. Varan found the cradle himself, before any servant or guard could bring him the news, because some instinct he could not name had pulled him toward the chapel that morning instead of the war room where his advisors already waited. The chapel bell had not yet rung for morning prayers. The snow outside had settled into a thin, undisturbed blanket across the courtyard, broken only by a single set of small footprints leading away toward the eastern wall, and then vanishing entirely where the drifts grew too deep to hold a shape. He noticed those footprints only afterward, in the long hours of searching that followed. In that first moment, all he saw was the cradle itself, stone and old and empty since before his own birth, now holding a small bundle wrapped in a coat he recognized instantly, because he had ordered it made himself, months ago, in the earliest days of a marriage he had not yet understood he was falling into. He crossed the chapel floor faster than any king should move in front of witnesses, though there were none yet to see him, and lifted the bundle with hands that had steadied armies and now shook like a boy's, and found himself looking down into a small sleeping face with dark hair and the faintest hint of gray already fading from her eyes. A face that carried enough of his own bloodline that no physician would ever need to confirm it, and enough of someone else's steady, quiet strength that he knew, immediately, entirely, whose daughter he was holding. "Where is she?" he said aloud. To no one. To the empty chapel. To the cold morning light filtering through frosted windows, and the question hung in the air with no answer to meet it. Governess Mabel found him there 20 minutes later, having returned to check on the child she had left, and the look on her face when she saw the king already holding his daughter told her everything about how this particular morning was going to unfold. "Tell me where she is," Varan said, before Mabel could speak a single word of her own. "I do not know where she went beyond the border road, my lady," Mabel answered honestly, because in truth she did not, Callum having wisely kept the midwife's name and village from anyone who might later be forced to reveal it under pressure. "She is gone, my king, and she left the child here exactly as the bargain always promised, and asked me to tell you nothing more than that." Varan's face, in that moment, according to the few servants who witnessed it from a careful distance, did something none of them had ever seen it do before. It broke, entirely, and without any attempt to hide the breaking. The careful, composed mask of a king who had spent years building walls against exactly this kind of loss, finally giving way completely, standing alone in a chapel with his daughter in his arms, and his wife gone into a winter mourning, with no trail left behind her that any tracker could follow. He did not rage the way the old stories claimed a wolf king might rage upon losing something precious. He did not summon the guard to scour the countryside, though eventually he did send riders in every direction, more out of desperate hope than any real expectation of success. Instead, in those first raw hours, he simply sat in the chapel with his daughter against his chest, and Governess Mabel, watching him from the doorway, understood that whatever had broken in this man was not going to mend quickly, and perhaps was never fully meant to mend at all, only to be carried differently from this day forward. Lady Miriam, when she learned the news, arrived at the chapel with an expression that Varan had never before seen turn against him so completely. "This is a disaster," she began, and Varan's head came up with an expression that stopped her mid-sentence, something in his pale eyes gone entirely feral in a way that had nothing to do with the moon. "The child is here," he said, his voice low and dangerous in a way none of his court had heard directed at his own mother before. "The bargain is fulfilled exactly as you always demanded it be fulfilled. If you say one more word about disaster in front of my daughter, I will remind you precisely why the wolves of this house have always been more dangerous than the humans who fear them." Lady Miriam did not speak another word that morning, though the look she gave her son as she withdrew carried a fury that would not fade quickly, and Varan, for the first time in years, found that he did not care. The search for Ilara stretched across weeks that felt to Varan like years, riders returning from every direction with nothing but rumors too thin to follow, a woman matching her description seen at a border crossing, another sighting further south that led to an empty farmhouse and a family who claimed no knowledge of any human girl passing through. Each failed report cut something new open in him, and each night he sat alone with his daughter, whom he had named Wren after his own grandmother, feeling the shape of a grief he recognized all too well and had promised himself, after the first time, he would never let himself feel again. But this grief was different, he came to understand. In the small, quiet hours when Wren slept against his chest and the castle around them finally fell silent, the first grief had come from a loss he could not have prevented, a birth gone wrong that no wall of caution could have stopped. This grief, he understood with a clarity that cost him more than any battle wound ever had, was a grief he had built himself, brick by careful brick, every time he had chosen his mother's politics over his wife's dignity, every time he had stood silent at a table where she was being diminished in front of him, every time he had stopped himself at her doorway, instead of crossing the threshold she had so clearly, so patiently, been leaving open for him. He had told her, once, that he did not know how to want something again without expecting to lose it. He understood now, holding his daughter and mourning a wife who was not dead but simply gone, choosing exile over a life she had never been allowed to fully share, that his fear of losing something had cost him the very thing he'd feared losing, as completely and finally as if he had lost her the old way after all. It was 3 months into the search, on a night when the last hard freeze of winter finally began to loosen its grip on the northern roads, that a rider returned with news different from all the ones before it, a name, a village, a direction that felt, for the first time since that empty chapel morning, like something Varan could actually follow. The village sat in a valley so far south that the snow had already given way to mud and the first stubborn green shoots of early spring, a cluster of low stone houses and goat pens tucked against a hillside, the kind of place a person could disappear into if they wanted badly enough not to be found. Varan arrived alone, without his guard, without his crown, wearing a plain traveler's coat that made him look, for the first time in years, like an ordinary man rather than a king, because he understood, riding those last miles, that if Elara was going to see him again, she needed to see the man first, and decide afterward what she thought of the crown that came attached to him. He found her by the goat pen behind the last house on the village's northern edge, her sleeves rolled up despite the cold, her hair longer than he remembered, and pulled back with a plain cord instead of the careful styles the castle's servants had once arranged for her, and she looked, watching her from the edge of that muddy yard, more entirely herself than he had ever once seen her within Blackpine's walls. She saw him before he could decide how to announce himself, and went very still, one hand resting on the fence post, and for a long moment neither of them spoke at all, the whole valley holding its breath around them the way it had once held its breath, months ago, across a snow-covered courtyard. "You found me," she said finally. "It took 3 months," he answered, "longer than it should have. I am sorry for every part of that delay that was my own fault, and there were more of those parts than I want to admit to you standing here." She did not run to him. She did not turn away either, which he understood. Standing there with his heart beating harder than it ever had in any battle, was itself a kind of answer, an opening he had not been certain he would find. "Ren is well," he said, when the silence stretched too long for him to bear it. "She has your patience already, and my mother's temper, which I am told is an unfortunate combination for everyone in the household who has to manage her tantrums." Something flickered across Elara's face at that, not quite a smile, but close enough to it that Varan felt a small fierce hope kindle in his chest for the first time in months. "I did not come to take her from you," Elara said. "I left her exactly where the bargain always said she belonged. I hope you understand that much at least." "I understand more than that now," he said. "I understand that I spent 11 months treating a bargain like it was the whole of what you offered me, when you were offering me so much more than that the entire time, and I was too afraid of losing it to ever reach out and take it properly. I understand that my silence at that table cost you more than any argument ever could have, and that every night since you left, I have sat with our daughter and understood, more completely each time, exactly what kind of fool I was. I am not asking you to come back to be my queen in name only," he continued, before she could answer, because he had rehearsed this on the long ride south, and was terrified that if he stopped now, he would never find the courage to finish. "I am asking you to come back, because Ren needs her mother, yes, but more than that, because I need my wife, the actual woman, not the vessel my mother always insisted you were, and I am asking you to believe that I have learned, finally, at far too great a cost, how to fight for something, instead of simply hoping quietly that it would stay without my ever needing to defend it." Elara studied him for a long moment, standing there in his plain traveler's coat with mud on his boots and an honesty in his face that she had waited 11 months to see and had almost given up hoping she ever would. "And your mother?" she asked. "What happens to her arrangements, her nursery on the far side of the castle, her belief that Ren belongs entirely to Blackpine's traditions and nowhere else?" "My mother," Varan said, "will learn to accept that this house belongs to the family I choose to build within it, not the one she believes she is entitled to control. I have already told her as much, and I will tell her again as many times as it takes, for as long as it takes, if you will only give me the chance to prove it to you in more than words." The valley around them stayed quiet, waiting, the goats shuffling in their pen, the first thin green shoots trembling faintly in a cold breeze that no longer carried the bite of true winter, and Elara, standing at that fence post with mud on her hands and a whole village's worth of quiet independence behind her, felt something in her chest that she had not let herself feel fully since the night she walked away from an empty stone cradle in the snow. She did not answer him immediately. She made him wait, the way she had waited so many months for him to cross a threshold he kept stopping short of, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the formal distance of that chapel wedding so long ago, only the plain, honest weight of a woman who had learned, the hard way, exactly what she was and was not willing to accept. "Then prove it," she said, "not to me standing in this yard, but every single day, for as long as it takes me to trust it completely again. I will come back to Blackpine, for Ren, and I will give you the chance you're asking for. But I am not the girl who stepped off that wagon 11 months ago, silent and afraid of embarrassing your house. If I come back as myself, entirely, and you will need to decide, every single day from now on, whether that is a woman you are finally ready to want. Varan crossed the last few feet between them then, the same distance he had failed to cross so many times in that cold castle. And this time he did not stop at any threshold, and when he reached for her hand across the fence post, she let him take it, and somewhere behind them, in the valley's small stone houses, a woman named Nora watched from her window, and finally allowed herself to believe that this particular story, unlike so many that had passed through her care, might actually end somewhere worth ending. They rode north together 3 days later, back toward Black Towers and a stone cradle no longer empty, and Alara did not know, watching the mountains rise ahead of her, exactly what kind of queen she would become in that house now, or what battles still waited with a mother-in-law who would not surrender her grip easily. But she knew, for the first time since a wagon had carried her away from everything familiar, that she was riding toward that uncertain future as herself, chosen rather than merely claimed, and that whatever came next, she would not be facing it silent and alone.